case monitor for the Missouri Department of Mental Health, and he's also an adjunct instructor here at UMSL, a very beloved adjunct instructor. He teaches our DSM class, and people always give him rave reviews. Students always give rave reviews. And then he also is field faculty, so he takes our students as in practicum. And he was appointed to the state committee for social workers a few years ago, 2015, is that right, 16?
I think, yeah.
Something like that. And more recently, he's been actually elected as the secretary for the Missouri State Commission for Social Workers. So if you have any questions about licensing or anything like that, Justin is your man. So.
And we will be doing another presentation October 23rd for any potential licensees who are interested. We basically go over the basics of what LMSW, LBSW, LCSW means, some of the testing materials that we've gathered as a campus that are available, and then typically we have a panel. So that's a great one. I think it begins at 3:45 on that Monday. So if you're interested, how many students do we have in here? Awesome. I definitely have seen a few that have been in my DSM class. I may have some of you in the CBT, RABT class that I'm teaching later this semester. So yeah, I don't know. Is there any housekeeping we need to do?
No more housekeeping things except your evaluation. If you can fill out your evaluation and drop it off on the table out there as you leave, that would be great. And then I've got the handouts for Justin's presentation this afternoon. So if somebody didn't get that, I can just raise your. Are the people who just came in, did they not get them?
I've sat some at the table, so if you do notice or you're seeing that someone next to you doesn't have a handout, feel free to guide them over in Diane's direction, which will be more than likely over in that corner. But yeah, so just in case, you know, with the bathrooms, there are some outside of both of these doors. There are some downstairs. It's kind of like going through a maze. Like if you confront a minotaur or something, trying to find your way to it, just make sure not to engage. So ethics, it's the one that people are always like, woo, ethics, right? You know, everyone loves to take it. It's not like it's required every 2 years for licensure renewal. It is. So we always have a turnout at ethics because people need to come. But what's great about ethics discussions and panels, and we will have a panel later with professionals currently in the mental health system, but we learn so much from each other's stories. So I do want this to be interactive. If I'm going over something, I want you to say like, whoa, you know, I've encountered that before. And this is that brief little synopsis without giving any personally identifiable information out. Because it's nice to know that we're not alone in this. If we look around the room, we see how many professionals are interested in ethics or are taking the course. So take the time to make some connections. You never know when those will come in handy. I think as a state committee member, I get a lot of emails and Facebook messages like, hey, help me with this. And I'm like, okay, I'm one person, I'm not the committee. So even though I may act like I'm like the expert all-knowing, that is not the case because as we know with ethics, there are so many shades of gray. Like some people would say there are 50. Yes. I wondered if anyone would catch that. So just to start it off on a high note, this is what I've had stuck in my head all morning.
Let's get physical, physical. I wanna get physical. Let's get physical. Let me hear your body talk. Your body talk. Let me hear your body talk. Woo! All right.
So they were singing, let's get ethical. Let's get ethical. No. But one of the things I want to make you familiar with is the state committee's website, just so you can access some of these resources that I'll be showing on the slides. Whenever I was going through school, as it should be introduced, the NASW Code of Ethics is what we learn, and that's how we should guide our practice. However, whenever I joined the committee, I'm like, what do you mean we don't have grounds for discipline? It's not ethical. And that song just played in my head again. But, and they're like, well, statutorily, we can only discipline on so much. So I wanted to highlight that stuff because I felt like that was something overlooked and maybe never described to me. And then also the disciplinary grounds that the board can take. You know, the great thing is the board is not there to punish you, but we are there to protect the citizens of Missouri from practitioners that may be using malpractice. So again, if at any point you have questions, please let me know. With this website, there are a couple of things. These are your committee members. We have a vacancy for an LAMSW, a licensed advanced macro social worker, and an LMSW. Governor Nixon, who appointed me, it took him 3 years. I initially applied as an LMSW. So it is worth trying with Governor Greitens to see if maybe he'll appoint faster. So if you are an LMSW, you are interested in becoming one, feel free to apply for that board. We don't have tons of LAMSWs though. How many people in here are BSWs? Awesome. MSWs? Licensed BSWs. Very cool. You do exist, so that's always nice to see. How about licensed master social workers and clinical social workers? Great. So we have an awesome mix of people. And how many are from other healthcare professions, such as professional counselors, nurses? Fantastic. So along with the committee membership, if we look down at the rules and statutes, and then rules and regulations, I will be reading from chapter 3. I was like, I don't know where it went, but so that is what is on my slides, as well as if we scroll down, 337, 630, that really talks about what can happen to your license. And then understanding the complaint process, these are all things that we'll be reviewing. So in your handouts, I initially started with mental health systems, since this is a day about mental health, but ultimately ethics apply to every field. However, what you have noticed if you've been in this field for a few years or even maybe on your first day, that mental health is in every field that you're working in. So whether you're working with children, hospice patients, the criminal populations in prison or jails. So this is what I laid out, and hopefully you can read that on your handout. This was me at like 2 or 3 in the morning when I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to type this presentation. And just kind of putting up there all of the systems that I've interacted with over my career that's been about 10 years. So that's a lot of systems. We have inpatient mental health and outpatient mental health. And also if you're noticing something, let me know so that I can maybe add it and grow this. But whenever we're looking at substance abuse treatment, people can go there voluntarily or they can go there involuntarily, both in inpatient and outpatient mental health. Private psychiatric hospitals are the same, although some psychiatric hospitals do not accept involuntary admission. So that is something to know prior to taking a client there with an affidavit. The state psychiatric hospital, we work with voluntary by guardian clients. Sometimes we'll get requests from prison. So they do not have guardians, they have not been committed to us, but it's incredibly hard to place some of the people with mental illnesses from prison, so they'll come to us. And then forensic commitment, and that's what I do. I monitor people who have been committed to the Department of Mental Health for committing crimes that can range from petty to first-degree murder. What happens is they go to the state hospital. If it is a violent major offense, then they go to Fulton State Hospital. They have to complete that program first and then go to places like in Kansas City, St. Joe, Farmington, or St. Louis. And from there, they work their way through a program, graduate the system, and they're released. And they're released with conditions, and I follow up with them, making sure that they are working with those conditions that basically say, follow the law. which is important for everyone, but with mental health, as we know, chronic mental health, we're going to see resurgences. Sometimes I will see violations of conditions, and we have to figure out, can we work with that person in the community, or for the safety of them or the community, do we need to take them back to the hospital? As far as outpatient, you have the substance abuse treatment, and then you have community mental health centers. One of those programs that community mental health centers do that are so great are the psychosocial rehabilitation, the clubhouses. Like, how many people are familiar with the Independence Center? It's a fantastic program. You should go talk to someone about checking it out. We have 2 down in my area, which is the Farmington area. There's also residential care, and these are all of the areas, and there may be more than that. So a residential care facility, what most people call a boarding home, and IRTs, which is intensive residential treatment. So these are individuals who require more oversight. A PISL is psychiatric intensive supported living, which typically is like 4 people per home because that's how much help they need. The ISL comes from the DD system. Children's homes, independent living, that would be a fantastic goal if everyone is capable of that. And one of the goals of mental health professionals is hopefully that this client is living as free of symptoms as they can be, and also that they're in the least restrictive setting. I keep running into this chair, so if you see me fighting something, it's this chair. Unfortunately, we have people come into the legal system. Some of that's through forensic mental health, but a lot of it's through jail, prison, and juvenile detention, so they're not really receiving the care that they could benefit from. And then finally, we have homeless shelters or homelessness and medical hospitals. And medical hospitals can very much be at a loss because they may not have psychiatrically skilled professionals there to assist. Any doctor can prescribe an antipsychotic, but they need to know, that that's not where their expertise is. You see a lot of people seeing primary care physicians for antidepressants and antipsychotics, and sometimes that works well for them, and sometimes it doesn't. So, jumping right into ethics. Again, this is not the NASW Code of Ethics. This is what the committee considers anytime that a complaint is brought in front of us. So the purpose is that people are practicing ethically, and we have disciplinary rules in the event that someone is practicing unethically. The ethical standards are set forth by the committee, and they are mandatory. The failure of a member of the profession to abide by this means that they can be held accountable through these statutes. The last slide that we do will talk about the disciplinary proceedings. So the rules set forth are the moral obligations of the ethical standards. The public must be protected from those of us who have this title and this ability to treat them, and we need to make sure that we're doing that ethically, that we're doing so with education, experience, high morals, and other relevant factors to that individual's treatment. Because when we're practicing outside of the scope of our practice is when we tend to get in trouble. And that may be coming from a very good place. But if you really want to help that individual or individuals like them in the future, then you should go and learn things. Not that you didn't in the program, but for each therapy and psychopharmacology, there are ways to learn more about that and how to practice it efficiently. So no member of the profession shall violate ethics, or ethical standards or disciplinary rules. You don't want to circumvent ethical standards or disciplinary rules through actions of another. Sometimes I think about, it's never comfortable to write a complaint on someone. And sometimes we don't do that because we're uncomfortable or they're our friend. There are situations where we can approach that person. Maybe it's not this grotesque violation of ethics. So there are a lot of ways to approach that, and we'll kind of hit on some of that as well. You do not want to engage in conduct which is dishonest, deceitful, or fraudulent. Medicaid billing, we receive letters every time we meet as a committee, and those can be very simple errors. And then there are repetitive offenders of that. which kind of make the process challenging. Has anyone applied for like Medicaid and Medicare boards? It's not an easy application process. You don't want to allow the pursuit of financial gain or other personal benefits to interfere with how you exercise your practice, and you want to make sure that you're using sound judgment. The use of therapeutic relationships with clients, you cannot promote yourself for personal gain or profit of an agency, commercial enterprise, or whatever. If Bill Gates was my client, you know, he's like, hey, you want to go into business? Like, no, I'm your therapist. But I really wish I had your money, you know. I need to do a sliding scale upwards, but so prior to recommending an applicant for licensure, a member of the profession should be satisfied. You know, it's a hard process to go through licensure, as we know in April of 2010, because I graduated in December of 2010 and had to take the LMSW. That's when the LMSW came about. Once you earn your LMSW, you can enter into supervision. And I've heard a lot of supervisors say, well, I'm not really comfortable with them, but I'm still going to recommend them because they put in all the work. Like, I understand that, but through that process of putting in that work, you have an amazing opportunity to address the issues that are making you uncomfortable. And you also have the ability to say, you know, I don't believe this is the right fit for you, and if you're needing someone to sign off on this, you'll have to go elsewhere. And you can always write a letter of concern to the committee in case that individual does go elsewhere, because we do need to consider that prior to licensing them. So, although a member of the profession should not become a self-appointed investigator or judge of applicants, a report to the committee of all unfavorable information, not otherwise privileged, should be made. It must be made. I love this pen, it's fun in class. So a member of the profession is subject to discipline for making a materially false statement or for deliberately failing to discuss a material fact requested in connection with an application. A member of the profession shall respond to all reasonable requests for information and/or all other correspondence from the committee. Failure to provide the requested information may be cause for denial of the licensure. What I've noticed since I've been on the committee is that a lot of people graduate school, and we all probably have lived in apartments while we were going to college, or maybe with our parents, or wherever that may be. One of the things and one of the expectations is that you go into the website, you update your address and phone number, because there have been multiple instances where we just needed to clarify something relatively small and we can't contact the licensee. So you put in all of that work, and then you're just not able to be contacted to answer questions. It's a little bit disheartening, so please remember that and advise licensees of that or fellow people going through the process. So you do not want to exploit your clients under any circumstances. That also includes students or supervisees and sexual intimacies. I don't know. It was kind of like drilled into our heads in school and at every ethics training we've been to, or any training that has nothing to do with ethics, and they're like, do not have sex with your clients. And I always think of like Mean Girls, like, or you'll die. Like, you probably won't, but you may lose your license or it may be disciplined. So sexual intercourse is defined as any penetration or contact with the female sex organ by a finger, the male sex organ, or any object. Sodomy is oral or anal copulation of sexual intercourse between two or more people or a person in an animal, or any penetration of the anal opening by any body part or object. So these are fun definitions. So kissing, not allowed. Touching or caressing the legs, thighs, stomachs. Basically, you shouldn't be like caressing your patient. Exhibitionism and voyeurism. So, you know, don't be the guy in the trench coat that's like, woohoo, you know, and also don't be the peeping Tom. comments, gestures, or physical contacts of a sexual nature. I can tell you, like with the Department of Mental Health, that if you're making if you're making comments of a sexual nature or of a violent nature towards someone else, that can be construed as verbal abuse if it's done in front of a client. A member of the profession shall report to the committee any known or suspected violations of the regulations that have been developed by the committee and passed by state law. And you want to do it in a way that doesn't violate a client's right to privacy. Through that process, we will send out releases of information so that if we send out an investigator, we'll be able to ask the questions we need to ask to form an appropriate opinion, because in many cases, a complaint does not mean that you've done something wrong. A complaint could be an unsatisfied outcome or dissatisfied outcome, or it could be not necessarily a violation of ethics, but we might write a letter of concern just saying like, hey, please don't do that. So keep that in mind. You also have the opportunity to respond to complaints. So if a complaint is lodged against you, you have that opportunity to appear in front of us or to write a letter, but don't allow your connection with someone or fear for that person to prevent you from filing a complaint if needed. Because ultimately, we want to make sure that we are practicing ethically, the people we're connected with are, and that we're also protecting the title of social work through that. So the rules set forth, these are for client relationships. A member of the profession shall not enter into a dual or multiple relationship. So can people in here give me examples of how that might have occurred in the past? Yes.
A client could be an artist and I could buy their stuff, or they could use art to paint.
Okay. So any thoughts on that?
I actually have multiple artists on my caseload right now, and it sucks. They're really gifted.
Yeah.
And I would love to have it, but it's a dual relationship because
Right.
it changes the power, there's always the power dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And it shifts that, and it makes them dependent on me, and it's murky, and it seems like I'm supporting this person.
Right.
Mm-mm.
Yeah.
It's a
So.
no.
Right, because they might come back later and say, hey, I really need money, can you buy more artwork? BJC Behavioral Health at the clubhouse down in Farmington does a fantastic art show, and that kind of allows you an appropriate venue to support clients with mental illness and fantastic gifts. Then you have clients who come up to you, like if you're in a hospital setting or in the community, who say, hey, I want you to have this, and it's just like a colored page or a quick doodle. Like, that's one that some people get worried about. A lot of times my response is like, hey, let's put it on the ward so everyone can see it. But at the end of the day, you have to gauge if it's going to cause them more therapeutic harm than not to refuse that gift. Is it a monetary value? Is it something that's putting them out? Those are all questions that you can ask. And the great thing about gray areas, because like I said, there are many of them, is that's what consultation is for. That's why we work with other professionals who understand our code of ethics and the positions that we're being put into. One of the things I wanted to highlight starts here. Business relationships do not include purchases made by the member from the client when the client is providing necessary goods or services to the general public, and the member determines that it is not possible or reasonable to obtain the necessary goods or services from another provider. I live in Farmington, which if you've not been, you're probably not missing much. But, I mean, we have Elephant Rocks and stuff like close to us, but we can't even claim that. If my car breaks down and my client shows up, I probably need to take that ride. The issue is, shows up as a towing company, you know. Not my client just saying, hey, let me give you a ride. So let me clarify, yes, that they are operating a tow truck. The issue comes in when they're like, hey, you know what, you're my therapist, so I'll just do this off the books. Or, hey, why don't I just find a different way to let you pay this back? Like, just work with that person, explain like, you know, you are the tow truck operator, I do need this towed, we're in a pretty remote area. So those are things that you can take into consideration, and ultimately you can always discuss later. The committee does really respect self-reporting because it shows that like maybe we erred, maybe we made an error, but we want to figure out how to do this in the future. Yes?
Is there I know this is so silly, but I know in some other professions, ethical codes, don't they have like after 7 years of discharge, or I thought I understood social work like ever.
Ever.
Yeah.
Like a Taylor Swift song. No. So you're correct. So the question was, after 7 years, can a friendship or an intimate relationship? And these are questions that are often asked. With social work, it is never.
No, if you were treating mental or emotional conditions.
So what would you be treating otherwise?
If I was a hospital social worker, I would be assessing and arranging for home care.
Okay, so good point. So that is different, but yes, if you are their therapist, if you're treating an emotional or mental condition, correct.
They might be my supervisee.
Okay.
It's not therapy.
Okay, so, right, at some point supervisees, students, they become colleagues, so that's another area where there isn't necessarily a clear answer, but if you're referring to these and you're making an informed decision, that would be the best way to approach it. Also with records, we'll discuss what you do with records after so many years as well, because that's another time limit people question often. So, you should be alert to issues. You should avoid conflicts of interest that interfere with the exercise of professional discretion and impartial judgment. A member of the profession should make clear to clients what the purpose of treatment is, what you hope to accomplish, boundaries. You shall not provide professional services to clients without being able to justify the basis upon which those services are rendered. So if you are billing for services, you have to be able to justify the basis. A member of the profession should be aware of his or her own mental health and emotional stability. I recently had someone say something very troubling, and they are in the profession of therapy doesn't work, but she wants to be a therapist, so it's a little bit counterproductive. And then also that she doesn't need to work on herself. She doesn't think anything's wrong, even when colleagues are telling her you should probably see a therapist before becoming licensed. So if you don't believe in what you're doing, you should probably find something else to do. So a member of the profession shall not undertake or continue a professional relationship with a client when the competency of the member is or reasonably could be expected to be impaired due to mental, emotional, physiological, pharmacological, or substance abuse conditions. If that condition develops during treatment, develops after a professional relationship has been initiated, the member shall notify the client in writing the need for termination and assist with finding additional resources. Yes?
Have you gotten reports, I don't know if this is mental health, but like if you find out a peer is clearly racist or sexist or homophobic, and they're working with clients and it may or may not be affecting the quality of their work. You're not really in a position to determine that. You don't know, what it is. But like, if you know they're racist and their client is a person of color, or so, have you managed that?
I don't know that I've seen that specific complaint. However, as professionals, if we would look to the NASW Code of Ethics, it would ask that we kind of address that concern with them, because it may or may not be an ethical issue. They might be able to set that bias aside and treat, but it very well could be a large issue. So I think addressing that concern or addressing it with your supervisor so it can be addressed, and then if they identify that, yeah, it is an issue, then they need further training, some self-exploration of biases, and any discriminatory actions, and if it is impacting, then a complaint should be made. So, good question. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Well, I'm also thinking about our bias, like my bias in terms of interviewing somebody for a job when they're saying something that makes it very clear that they're a pretty observant Christian. And then I make several assumptions based on that and kind of take it out and think potentially they could think things that I don't think are necessarily as inclusive as I would like them to
Sure.
be, but I don't know.
Right.
And so maybe I'm being discriminatory, but I can't ask them, like, you're a great Christian, does that mean you don't believe in gay marriage? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it's really.
But there are ways to ask questions. How comfortable are you treating members of the LGBT community? How would you approach treatment with, because it sounds like from what you were saying earlier, you treat people of the LGBT community, specifically of the trans community. So those are important questions to ask, I think, of any applicant.
Well, it's tough because when you work for a big organization, you have preset questions. So I can't go like out of my lane and ask one person about how they handle
ask them all.
LGBTQ,
Ask everyone
and then
the
not
same
ask everybody else. And then
Right.
that would have to go through HR, which have to go through corporate, it has to go through legal, and 4 years later, they'll give me an answer.
Yeah, but still, it's definitely, you're right, you have to ask everyone if you're going to have it on your questions for preset questions. The Department of Mental Health is very similar. But if you're receiving pushback from your organization, which is very possible because, you know, they only think legally, that's when you can involve agencies like Promo or MTUG, who's going to come in and maybe educate these corporate people, and they might already have those connections, because cultural sensitivity is a big factor in social work. I mean, not everyone that we treat looks or acts just like us. And those assumptions are going to happen. Whenever we were interviewing a chaplain for the Sex Offender Rehabilitation and Treatment Services program, we discussed with them the various religions that are present there, and there's a wealth of diversity in that facility: Native American, Wiccan, pagan, Christian, Catholic, Jewish, you know, I mean, just on and on and on. And you could tell from their responses whether they were receptive or they were going to be trying to convert people. And that would not go over well in that facility. So definitely approach someone about that. Consider seeing if you can ask different questions, culturally sensitive questions that are still within the realm of legally appropriate as well. So, yes.
Maybe I'm just emphasizing what you've already said, but I'm a strongly Catholic person, and I would hate to be lumped in with the assumptions I think she's making.
Sure.
But I wouldn't mind at all if you asked me behaviorally specific questions of how I would think, how I would act
Right.
with certain situations or persons.
Right, absolutely, because you could have two people go even to the same congregation and not have the same ideas on some of these, you know, a lot of the individuals that we are treating. So that's a fantastic point. Furniture and I are just not getting along. So if a dual relationship develops or is discovered after the professional relationship has been initiated, the member of the profession shall terminate the professional relationship in an appropriate manner. They shall notify the client in writing of this termination and shall assist the client in obtaining services from another professional. We've had practitioners develop attractions to people that they are treating. We are all human beings, so they terminate services so they can date them. Ethical or not ethical? Okay, good response. Never, correct. You should be knowledgeable about the services available in your community, yes.
Can you go back to that question?
Absolutely.
Talk about how they write the letter. Because I have also been aware of people who write that letter and say, because I'm so attracted to you.
Oh, yeah. A very open and honest person, aren't they? So, I mean, you should always be professional in your interactions with your clients. They don't necessarily need to know, but you can say that there's a conflict of interest or something of that nature. you want to provide some level of closure, but they don't necessarily need to know that because, again, Corey mentioned earlier the power dynamic and that struggle sometimes. There could be influence on what they think if they receive news like that in a letter. So, where was I? You should know about the services in your community. When I came up from Farmington to Baldwin to work hospice for a year, I remember from social work classes, Dr. Duranier, who has since moved on, I almost said passed, that is not true. She's since moved on to Florida. She told us about Paraquad, which living down there I knew nothing about, but I came up here and a client needed a ramp built, and I'm like, I'm calling Paraquad, and even if they don't have the services or the funding at that moment, they can direct me elsewhere, which they did. So I was able to get the appropriate application and start that process with the client so they could get the ramp built. We cannot be all-knowing whenever it comes to community resources, but that's the whole point whenever we're at conferences like this, that we're communicating, connecting, networking, resourcing, et cetera. Or just calling agencies and saying, I don't know if you can help me with this, but maybe you know someone who can. And it's okay to do that because those are probably agencies that they're already working with. So when a member of the profession has a relationship, particularly of an administrative, supervisory, and/or evaluative nature with an individual seeking counseling services, the licensed social worker provisional member shall not serve as the practitioner for such individual, but shall refer the individual to another professional. The member of the profession must inform clients about electronic recording of sessions, how such sessions will be used, and provide specific information about any specialized or experimental activities in which they may be expected to participate as a condition of service. So this might be part of your informed consent, for example. A member of the profession shall terminate a professional relationship when it's reasonably clear that the client is not benefiting from the therapeutic relationship. Some clients will continue to come to you, but as a practitioner, we should be able to step back and have a moment where we question, is what I'm doing effective, and have that conversation with the client. Sometimes clients will be pretty upfront about it, and then we as human beings want to become defensive or maybe like rebound with something, but I think it's most important that we're taking the time to fully evaluate what we're doing, the effectiveness, and then referring them on if need be. A member of the profession shall protect clients against physical threats, intimidation, and coercion in the provision of social services when reasonably possible. We've heard of the horror stories where we know someone comes in and they're suicidal and they have a plan and a hospital releases them and they commit suicide. Someone's homicidal, they have a plan, they go and commit suicide. Those are all dangerous things. And a lot of that precedent's kind of set forth by the Tarasoff case in California, because he said, I'm going to kill my ex-girlfriend, and he went and did it after the counseling session, and the I believe, psychologist didn't report that because of confidentiality. So I always think of some of the test prep materials, and there's this acronym ASPIRINS, and the P is for Protect Life. So that should always be a focus of our treatment. A member of the profession shall not attempt any intervention unless thoroughly trained in its use. How many people in here know EMDR? So eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing. And a lot of people are like, oh, hypnosis, and it's, the finger waving or the lights or the tapping on the legs to stimulate different areas of the brain. It is so cool, but I haven't been trained in it. So I can't say like, hey, let me do some EMDR on you. It's not a cheap training, but it's a highly effective training, and that's not something that you would want to pose as having the professional knowledge of, because you could do more harm than good. A member of the profession rendering services to a client shall maintain professional records. This should include the presenting problem. Why are they here to see you? The assessment that you do, the plan of action, and the progress notes. It should also include the fee arrangement, such as a sliding scale, or if you have a standard fee that this person's able to meet, the date and substance of each contact with the client, notation and results of formal consults with other providers, a copy of all evaluative reports prepared or received as part of the professional relationship, a copy of written communication with the client identifying the date and reason for termination of the professional services, if you're in private practice, and then the clinical records of a member of the profession who is under supervision shall also be co-signed by the supervisor. Yes?
Is that one under review right now?
That one is under review. In 2014, I had actually submitted a letter asking for 75% of supervision. We take our tests if we want to. And then my supervisor submitted this. The committee passed it, but there's so many bureaucratic steps that it has to go through to actually be put into the CSR that when Governor Nixon left office, Governor Greitens came in and sent back every single rule and statute ever created by any of the committees for public review. So they are currently under public review. They asked for a realistic time frame to pass these things, so we're hoping that those two things might squeak by in the very near future. Because it's not realistic. We have supervisors who are supervising other people and other agencies who have very strict rules where people are not just allowed to come in and sign their records, and it's also a bit unrealistic. Through part of the supervision, you should know what how your person's documenting. Ask for samples of how they document, or for cases, ask if they have questions about the documentation. But a lot of agencies might not give you access to that information. Some will though, so if you have that ability and they can bring it with you to supervision or you do it at their agency, then by all means, but I think the board realizes that that is a constraint that not everyone can meet. So for the purpose of these rules, you need to hold records for at least 5 years after the date of service. So whenever I always think 7 years, that might be a DMH thing, but it is 5 years. So it's important to know, especially if you're in private practice or if your agency has particular policies about purging records before that date, you might want to educate them. A member of the profession shall not falsify or permit the unauthorized destruction of patient records. This happens more than you would think. There are times people are going to forget to document things, but there are ways to document those things as late entries. Not like, oh no, I'm being called on the stand or I don't have this stuff in there. You can't just go in and like implant it into the record, which has happened in several agencies, and these agencies almost are exclusively using electronic medical records, which means that they know when a record has been modified. So it's pretty easy to catch someone in the act. So just make sure you're documenting when you're seeing the client and within a reasonable time frame, because again, we are human, we will forget things. I actually write handwritten notes and then go back and document, try to within the week, but we're all social workers, we understand the constraints. Yes?
Can we record audio or video on a session for the purpose of supervision?
Yeah.
Do we have to maintain those or can we delete those?
I would say that it's part of the record, but I would encourage you, because I'm just one member, to email the board, maybe even today, and we can potentially get it on the agenda for this coming Thursday when we meet again. Because I think that's a good question.
There's no mandate to keep that, and it's got a specific purpose.
Yeah, so I mean, if the client is identified and they're saying they're willing and it's part of treatment, I would consider it a record. But again, I'm one board member, so feel free to email. And any decision that we make in open session is available in the minutes. So, great question. Sorry I didn't have a more definitive answer. So, rules for relationships with colleagues. A member of the profession should act with integrity when interacting with colleagues. other organizations, agencies, institutions, referral sources, and other professions, so as to facilitate the contribution of all colleagues toward achieving optimum benefit for clients. If you've ever had interagency communications about a client, you have probably seen that this is not always the smoothest part of the conversation. So it's like, hey, we're all in this together to treat this client, common goals, but all of these barriers because we have the PHI, and that's important. A member of the profession shall not knowingly cause a client to terminate the service of another professional solely for personal gain. So like, hey, just ditch that therapist and come to my practice. If you're having that informal of a conversation with them, I'm guessing you're probably pretty close to them as well. One of the things I think of, and I don't know that it specifically applies under this, and these were not social workers, but there was a ward at the hospital who had a huge focus on Christian services for the clients, which if they found benefit from that, that's fantastic. But it had become almost like this lynching mob. They found out one of the social workers treating them was not a Christian, and they refused to work with her, and that's because the staff said that. I'm like, that's so inappropriate, unethical, people should be fired, but you know, they didn't have the ethics, they didn't have a licensing board, so it was mainly up to the facility on how to handle that. But if you're impacting the treatment of a client, then that's incredibly unprofessional and unethical. A member of the profession shall not exploit his or her professional relationships with supervisors, colleagues, supervisees, students, or employees, either sexually, economically, or otherwise. A member of the profession who has direct knowledge of a social work colleague's impairment, which is due to personal problems, psychosocial distress, substance abuse, or mental health difficulties, and which interferes with practice effectiveness, should consult with that colleague when feasible and assist the colleague in taking remedial action. I don't know about all of you in here, but if someone has an issue with the way I'm doing something, I would much rather them come to me and say it so that we can have a conversation, figure out maybe how I can improve things. And it's hard at times to get feedback or constructive criticism, or even when it's not so constructive. You know, I've had clients yelling and cussing and calling me every name you can ever imagine, but I'm like, they're clearly upset about something, so I need to be hearing if they're saying things that can help me and benefit their treatment, which is really hard to do in the moment. Yes.
I have a question on the following slide.
Okay.
I have my own practice, and I also am a contractor for a clinic and do pediatric counseling primarily. And I don't know if this is something, you know, just being our ethical things we're talking about, but I will refer sometimes my patients like a community mental health center, or we have a federally qualified center that has caseworkers, psychiatrists, possibly something we don't offer, and they will tell the client, you have to have everything done here. And so if there's a social worker who has been treating a client who I was treating, would that be something that, because it's been an issue that we've talked to, you know, the places that we're referring our clients, and we try to tell our clients, you have a right, if you want to go there, that's fine.
Right.
But we do feel like it's interfering with the client's work, and also sometimes then us, when we know we need to make a referral, we need to do that, but then it's almost like we have to prep our clients who may not understand they have a choice.
Right. Like, it's almost like you might have to be terminated to get services. So that's incredibly challenging, and it's ultimately going, you know, it might not necessarily, even if you always have the fine balance of following organizational guidelines and rules and then practicing ethically, and you know, because you have to have a job to practice. But so I always think, you know, it's continuing conversations between those two agencies and organizations, and then potentially if you know that it is like one social worker specifically saying that as opposed to the agency, you can notify us of that because it is like a profit and gain thing. Well, I don't know their specific guidelines and if there is rationale to why everything needs to be done there.
I think sometimes it's how the intake person may be trained too, and sometimes
Right.
that person is a social worker and sometimes they're not.
Mhm.
So, but it's just something that continually seems to happen, and wasn't sure. I mean, I tend to want to do things about something that's
Mhm.
not ethical, and I know that we're supposed to, but then I'm not exactly sure. It may or may not be a social worker who is doing that. And it has caused quite a bit of confusion. We have some clients who, in the clinic setting, see me and the psychiatrist, and they'll come back and they've been told they have to see the psychiatrist. I mean, they're seeing 2 psychiatrists then.
Right.
It's just causing problems all the way around.
It's a billing issue, right?
And just for the client.
Mhm.
I don't know.
Feedback?
Well, I can speak to that because I'm at an agency that provides a lot of services. And when somebody tells you that they can't continue working with you as a private therapist, they're pretty low level and don't understand what they're talking about, because it's really comes down to duplication of billing services, which is fraud for Medicaid. So you would speak to a higher up supervisor who would say, what we're going to do is we're going to just get an authorization to discuss. We're going to keep that kid with you because that's best practice. The kid is going to see our psychiatrist and also get our community support services, and we're all going to have communication. And we also have to put a notation that we can't have that kid do our in-house CBT therapist or DBT, because that's a duplication of billing.
So you would suggest if I'm going to make a report?
Yeah, you need to talk to somebody higher up and just say, I'm not going to step on, yeah. Because the different roles just have to be different.
Okay.
So somebody, an intake just is kind of a blanket
Right.
and safe to say, well, then you just have to leave that, but that's really not the case. And we actually encourage them to stay with their community provider, particularly children.
Right.
We want them to stay with you, and we'll work around that any way we can.
Right, I mean, they
Is
go,
that when they're in the health home as well? Like, can they still see an outside therapist when they're?
What, healthcare homes?
In the healthcare home? Because I thought my understanding was with the healthcare homes that they saw everybody at the FQ.
Like it's all inclusive.
It's all in one-stop shop. That's kind of how it was
It
sold.
can be, but it doesn't have to be.
Okay.
so healthcare homes can be all-inclusive or they don't have to be. I'm just doing this for Columbia who's tuning in. So it's like with a skilled nursing facility, for example. Once a client gets there, BJC ends up having to discharge them off their services for, I mean, we try to, and the role that I do is kind of facilitating care between all of these agencies. But we try to keep BJC on as long as possible before it becomes an issue. So as like a transition of care or continuity of care, they can sometimes have that transition. But ultimately, we should be doing whatever's therapeutically appropriate for our client. I wish that sometimes we could take out these organizational hierarchies who, you know, see dollar signs and not clients.
Well, we go offline billing. So like if one of our clients goes to inpatient hospital or residential rehab for after their heart attack or whatever, if an agency is billing Medicaid 24 hours, we go offline in terms of we continue to see them, our workers get engagement and productivity,
Sure.
but we don't generate billing.
Mhm.
And there's just like a box we click saying like they're in a SNF, they're in a da-da-da. So they don't generate billing, so we're not duplicating and doing and preventing fraud. If they live in a SNF, that's gonna be for a while. It's not a 3 weeks at St. Mary's rehab. So we'll stick around for 3 weeks at St. Mary's, but if they move into like Holly Hills or whatever, we'll do a transition and then discharge, because we can't like not bill forever.
Right.
So
Yeah, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, our employers do have to make money to pay us, so, you know. But at the same time, if the client needs a skilled nursing facility, you have to weigh out, obviously these services are more necessary than the ones that we are able to provide with the capabilities of our agency. So, like you said, you might stick around for a little while, but eventually you're gonna have to discharge them because that's more of a long-term care plan, so. Any other things on this slide? We've talked about approaching another colleague, allowing them the benefit of the doubt, hoping that they can correct their actions or maybe explain why they've done something. sometimes those things are like so egregious that you just need to report them. You need to report them to your agency. You need to report them to the board. You know, sleeping with a client, there's not much remediating that. So if you realize that they're having issues and maybe some interpersonal boundaries, that would be a great time. And I think as a teammate, I would want someone to step in and call it to my attention if I were having issues, because you deserve the opportunity to address it. And we all work in such an immersive field, and we're so engaged and so empathetic with the clients that those things can happen, that issues can happen. We want to skirt around systems sometimes to make sure they can get the benefits they need. But those reminders can be due even for the best of social workers. A member of the profession who functions as a supervisor or an educator shall not engage in sexual intimacies or contact as defined in the rules, which we went over all of those fun terms. So this includes students, trainees, or other colleagues over whom they exercise professional authority. A member of the profession must exercise appropriate supervision and provide appropriate working conditions, timely evaluations, constructive consultation, and experience opportunities. Not everyone in here, they may not have a social work supervisor, or if you're an LPC or an RN, you may not have a supervisor who's part of your profession, and that can sometimes make things a little bit challenging if not everyone's on the same page. One of the things that I encourage people to do is just remind their supervisors of this. I've had licensees or people under supervision saying, my supervisor, I've told them time and time again that they need to provide an attestation, and they're not doing that. And I'm like, because maybe they picked a supervisor who wasn't the best organized or has a lot of things going on right now. So, you know, I just always instruct them, just remind them that that's their professional obligation. And if they have concerns about filling out this attestation because of your performance, they also need to be discussing that with you as well. And providing feedback. That's the whole point of receiving supervision and starting out in this profession. So, statements and fees. A member of the profession shall not give or receive a commission or rebate. Basically any form of payment for referral of clients or professional services, engage in fraud or misrepresentation, use relationships with therapeutic or therapy clients to promote personal gain, profit for the agency, commercial enterprises, which has been discussed previously as well. Render services until assured the clients are aware of the fees and billing arrangements. It's unfair to say, sure, I'll treat you, and the client has no idea what they are paying or how they're going to be billed. You know, you should know what insurance is going to pay on that client if that's approved, because ultimately the last thing we want to do with someone who's coming to us, maybe with emotional or mental distress, is now cause them financial distress as well or add to it. A member of the profession shall use only those educational credentials associated with his or her license and practice as a licensed social worker, making sure that you went through a CSWE accredited program. Part of the licensing process is that we verify that you did, because it's now a requirement that you have an MSW, although some people were grandfathered previously. A licensed clinical social worker holder shall use his or her title in any advertising, public directory, or solicitation, including telephone directory listings, regardless of whether the presentment is made under the licensee's name, a fictitious business or group name, or a corporate name. I had a question, it actually came from one of my colleagues here, someone asking them about it. Hey, I want to call myself a therapist. I'm like, we're not necessarily concerned with that. We need people to know that you are an LCSW. You need to also understand that there are protected titles. Like, you can't call yourself an LMFT if you're not licensed to be a marriage and family therapist. So it's just being aware of other professionals' licensing credentials. If you're not an LPC, don't use LPC. Even though it might look nice to have an entire alphabet behind your name, most people don't even know what that means anyway. You know, it's like there are too many to keep up with. A member of the profession shall have his or her license prominently displayed at all times as proof of licensure to the client. Social workers whose licenses have lapsed or been revoked shall not hold themselves out to be currently licensed. We typically run into issues, and I'll get right to you, Corey. We run into issues where people do not renew their license in a timely manner, or they check that they have done the CEU certificate, that the contact hours, and then it turns out through audit they haven't. That entire time, they're not a licensed professional, and if you're billing or practicing as a licensed professional, you're violating the Title Protection Act. Yes, Corey?
So, is that number 4 actually? So we moved to a new workspace at our building where we no longer have areas.
Right.
And so we were actually debating, like, having a discussion, some of the social workers that are licensed, having a discussion about that, because we're supposed to have our stuff be, and yet our work is telling us we can't have any personal effects
Right.
displayed. So
I wouldn't consider that personal, it's professional.
yes.
Yeah.
So we're just kind of having that, like, how would we even talk? Do we have like a wall of license?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Or that's prominently displayed.
Right. I think you also, you need that opportunity, like you can produce that license if asked as well. So have that conversation with them, see what their responses are, and then you can always ask for backup, like from the board. Not that we can necessarily give legal advice, but we could maybe provide some clarification in the event that an organization's policies don't allow for it. But just make sure they're distinguishing between personal and professional. Like personal, if I walk in and I see a picture of your family or your puppy, like that's personal. But you know, if you're saying you're a licensed clinical social worker, your client should have a way to verify it. It's like going to a plastic surgeon or a surgeon and saying, this is the procedure I want done, and they're like, cool, but you don't need to see the proof that I can practice. It might not turn out so well. So have those ongoing conversations and then let us know if it shakes out differently, okay? A member of the profession shall not accept compensation for the professional services from anyone other than the client without disclosure to the client or his or her legal guardian. A member of the profession shall not accept for professional services any form of remuneration, including the bartering of services, which has the effect of exploiting the professional relationship or creating a dual or multiple relationship. And again, the key word there is exploiting. A member of the profession shall consider the value of his or her services and the financial ability of clients in establishing reasonable fees. A member of the profession shall not accept a fee for professional services or any form of remuneration from clients who are entitled to services through an institution or an agency or other benefit structures unless clients have been fully informed of the availability of the fact that basically other payments can be made from these other sources. So does anyone have anything they want to discuss about fees? Sometimes can be tricky. Like I said, we get basically if Medicaid does an investigation or an audit and they found that even if it's a small amount, they send a letter to you and they send a letter to the state committee saying, hey, you owe us money back. Some of those are like $500 and some are like $40,000 and higher. That's like a lot of money. So I don't know, has anyone encountered, yes?
Not that, but then it sounds like if I see a person for self-pay, but they qualify to wait 6 months to go to the YWCA trauma treatment team, I'm violating the regulation?
As long as they're fully informed, you're not. They have another option, but they can still choose to self-pay for you. So, good clarification.
And if they want to self-pay, but they have insurance, so it's as long as they're informed.
Yeah, I think so. Because, I mean, ultimately, I could go to the doctor and self-pay too. Anymore, that will cost me an arm that I was trying to have repaired. But So any other questions about fees? As long as you guys are getting paid. Okay. We have had a few things, I guess, just to be aware of. Whenever you go to a new organization and you know that they're going to be billing under your license, you want to make sure to read the contracts that they're having you sign. Because people have signed contracts not even realizing what they're signing, and then the organization has misbilled or done something that goes against social work ethics, and they're like, yeah, but I didn't approve that. You know, whether you're reviewing the billing or you've given access to your license, like, you need to be conscientious of what's happening. So, confidentiality. I think all of us are probably pretty familiar with that. A member of the profession shall take reasonable personal action and inform responsible authorities or inform those persons at risk when the conditions or actions of a client indicates that there's clear and imminent danger to the client or others. When the member is uncertain about the duty to protect, consultation with other professionals is appropriate. A member of the profession shall inform clients at the onset of the professional relationship of the limits of confidentiality. So, any personal stories or urban legends that we've heard about these things? Yes?
I had a duty to warn for homicidal, which I know there's more urban legends about that than I've actually heard. So I was working with forensics, and this woman told me how mad she was at her boyfriend. He was cheating on her. She got an STD, yada. So she had this plan to kill him. They all want to kill their boyfriends, no big deal. So I'm like, so how would you do that? And she goes through this step-by-step plan of like boiling water for spaghetti, then having sex with him, and then going to get the spaghetti dinner for him while he like dozes in bed, which he always did, and then taking the pot of boiling water and dumping it on him. So that's pretty realistic. And so we did a duty to warn, which was complicated because obviously the boyfriend wasn't listed as like a family member or off to discuss, or like he was named in the psychosocial, but his name was like Buggy, or I mean whatever. So like we had to do some serious detective work, and she was hospitalized. And she actually ended up, she was the one that gave us Buggy's name and number, and we told him of the plan, and he said that he would not go have sex with her and agree to eat spaghetti in the future.
So now Buggy's traumatized of spaghetti.
But I mean, it's rare to really hear like a real homicidal plan.
Yeah.
And I was kind of like, wow, this is that duty to warn thing I learned about in graduate school.
Yeah.
Is that still a thing?
This really happened. Yeah.
Really happened? Yeah.
So, how many people have had instances where they've had to do a duty to warn? Okay. So, a lot less than half of the room. It's nerve-wracking. It's like the first time, like as a student or a new professional, and you have to make a hotline. You're like, oh my God, I don't want to do this. I feel bad. Like, I don't know. I'd rather someone be alive. So, I think it's just encouraging colleagues when they are struggling to know that if you're practicing in the best interest and the safety of the consumer or the public, that it's hard to be making a wrong decision at that point because you really don't know if they're going to follow through with it or not. And whenever it's that planned, it's pretty set. Yeah. Yes.
I certainly have to discern.
Yes.
But part of the issue is if it's not imminent and specific, it won't do any good.
Right. And then you are looking at violating the confidentiality of that client. So it's discussing further with them and examining, like, do we need, like, tell me more about this. Because ultimately, if they sit there and they say, well, you know, I have been thinking of doing this, this, and this. How many people work in an emergency room? Okay, cool. One person. So do you guys assess for suicidality and homicidality?
We do. I typically don't.
Right.
But we ask pretty much everybody that comes in about safety, about suicide.
Right. Yeah, and for most people who haven't done it, they're like, what? Why are you asking me that? But then for the people who do, you can usually tell when they're about to say, whether they are, with our hospital, when we had state-funded emergency rooms, which I miss dearly, it was SI or HI, like suicidal or homicidal ideation. And it was so important to know that was like one of the admission criteria, as it is with all voluntary hospitalizations or involuntary, like are they a danger to themselves or someone else? Sometimes people can't get treatment if they're not, which is troubling because they could be days away from becoming dangerous or hours away, so it's really hard. And again, you're looking at operating within the confines and with bed space, but as a social worker, I think our role would be to strongly advocate for someone getting help. So I don't know, any other stories about risk and duty to warn? I will tell you, like as a hospital, basically we're like duty to warn to everyone who they ever offended against. And I'm like, no, that is not the case. There's very specific criterion. Whenever someone's released from a state hospital with a forensic crime or with threatening someone, we have to be able to prove to the courts that we followed duty to warn, and duty to warn, not warm. It's not a baguette, but so that we did so appropriately. A member of the profession shall keep confidential therapy relationships with clients, including information obtained with this relationship with clients, with the following exceptions. When given consent by the client, and you want written consent, when the client constitutes a danger to himself or herself or to others, when the member is under court order to disclose information, and when required by law. So, any questions about that? Yes.
Obtained from clients could be not about the client at all. It could put me into insider trading information. It could make me know more about politics.
Right.
Is that all inclusive? Is that?
So no, I mean it's with these exceptions is when it is. I don't want you to be the next Martha Stewart though. So although she's rebounded quite successfully, but you had a question back there. Or a comment.
When they talk about a crime they committed in the recent past or sometimes the far past and it involved a minor, and it's like you report if the crime has occurred, it's done, but there's like a statute of limitations. I mean,
Correct.
it gets tricky. You have to talk to your supervisor and
Yeah.
legal and
That's it. I mean, at SORT, people start opening up. So this is Sex Offender Rehabilitation and Treatment Services, and they're reporting things, and we're like, we need to talk to someone, So we talk to someone and determine if we need to inform Highway Patrol or if further charges need to be pursued. But you're right, there's a statute of limitations. It's always important to follow your agency's or organization's guidelines, to consult with the supervisor or peers if maybe you're in private practice. So. Yes, Melissa.
Who disclosed to me that before coming to the hospital, he had held a knife to himself and was thinking about attempting suicide. And at this point, he was already in hospital, but I had disclosed that to his mother in hopes that when the patient were to return home, that she would take preventative measures, lock him back and things like that. Was he technically in danger to hurt himself, or was that because he was already in care that was not assuming I hadn't disclosed?
Okay, so you had a client who went to the hospital, held a knife to their neck. You disclosed that to their mother, hoping safety measures would be in place, and you're questioning whether that should have been disclosed or not.
Right, notably, he had held a knife up to himself in the past.
Okay, in the past, okay. So I don't know, feedback from the room. I don't want to be like the only person answering questions.
12 or 13, like that?
oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
yeah. So that was fairly definitive, right? So and it is different too. Like you have a minor and you have a guardian of that. That mother would be a guardian of the minor, correct? They're the legal custody and such. So I do not work with children, as a disclaimer. So one came into the ER once and I was incredibly unnerved. So.
It's not that clear, to be fair. We had a 16-year-old who we really wanted a drug test on her because we were concerned about it, and her with her psych meds, like it was gonna be a problem. And she didn't want to give us a urine sample, not because she didn't want us to know, and she understood why we wanted it. We weren't gonna punish her, we just wanted to make sure she was gonna be safe and the doctor would be informed and could make better decisions about prescribing. She wanted to know if we were gonna tell her mother what the result of the urine test was. So the question is, at 16, can we tell her that the result of that drug test is confidential from her mother? Are you all waiting for it?
There's actually separate.
Yes, separate. We could actually keep that confidential. We encouraged her to allow us to tell her parent, but she did not want us to do that, and we did not tell her parent the result of the drug test, and she took the drug test, and her mom could ask for the record. I mean, there's ways around it, but like we weren't compelled to tell the mother.
Right.
Because she was
You actually have to
16.
keep that information separate from your record that you can release to the parent.
If she had been like 14, it would have been ugly.
Yeah.
16 made it clear. Yeah.
So I mean, it's an interesting conversation happening here for those who are in Columbia. Basically, a 16-year-old took a drug test. There could be negative interactions with their psychotropic medications. The question was whether you can disclose that or not. And what we're hearing is that there are separate laws. And, you know, it can go back all the way to age of consent laws too, like when is a child appropriate to make their own decisions. So I always think it's appropriate when in a gray area, don't just act, you know, make sure that you are talking to someone, make sure that even if you have to involve it, and maybe I'm fortunate, and I won't say in every way, but in some ways to be in the Department of Mental Health, because I can just email General Counsel and say, hey, what do you think about this? And they can shoot me back a response saying, no, this is against the law, this is violating consumer rights. I know not everyone has that access, but I'm guessing if you're in an organization, you have some kind of legal representation that your supervisor or their supervisor can always contact for clarification.
We got the most clarification from NASW, actually.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah.
online. I mean, like, it's out there. It's
Okay.
a question that's not new.
Yeah, and I mean, NASW, if you are a member of NASW or even on their website that's accessible to the public, you can always access them with questions regarding ethics. If you call Tamitha in Missouri, who's now also splitting her time between Alaska, she said she really wanted Hawaii, but it didn't work out. So you call her and you're like, hey, here's my NASW number, here's my ethical dilemma. And of course, she's one voice as well, but she's very well versed in the laws, so it's a good, like an additional safety net as a practitioner. So any questions from the discussion that was just had? Or additional follow-up questions or comments? So a member of the profession shall not forward to another person, agency, or potential employee any confidential information of a client without the written consent of the client or their legal guardians, nor should they violate any laws or regulations of the state or federal government with respect to this information. Who in here does EAP? Anyone? Okay, so we have a couple of EAP practitioners. That's great. What happens when, you know, employee referred to you for some issues at work? What can and what can you not disclose in that situation?
Things that directly affect client care and safety.
Okay, so things that directly affect client care.
I was totally drunk when I did that home visit and like passed out at the wheel in the driveway.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever.
Right?
But it doesn't happen now.
Sure. Any other information you can think of that you would disclose? Yes?
That they attended.
That they attended, yeah. Especially if it's like court order, like they have to know they're showing up, otherwise they might be going to jail. So make sure to share that with the courts. All right, any other feedback on that? Yes?
Well, I know a client of mine was fired, and she came back and asked if it was because I disclosed anything, and I, said no, and, I said if you want to refer to the contract we have for services, but I think it does really need to be talked about. I learned from that in the beginning with them.
Mm-hmm.
what we can and can't do. Because like you said, sometimes when they're signing things, they don't know what they're signing.
Right.
She was not happy, and but she did. But after it was just a really short conversation, and after I explained it, she was okay. But I could see where it was heading,
Right.
because she thought that possibly I had. She didn't even know, though, really.
Mm-hmm.
If I.
Yeah, so someone had been fired and she came back to you asking what you had disclosed, basically, and you were able to pull out the contract. You were able to, the informed consent, whatever paperwork you're having that client sign, that tells them what you can and cannot disclose. So, that's always great practice, and that's why it's important to keep records for 5 years. You never know when that person's going to come back. And sometimes just through the process of grief, because we can grieve when we lose a job or any kind of loss, really, it's looking for some kind of explanation or reason outside of ourselves. So, yes. Oh, sorry, I thought you raised your hand. My peripheral vision's going wonky. Yes.
The job or anyone in the job.
Yeah, so any intent to harm, and that not only applies to this, but then, to the others preceding. Yeah, suicide, child abuse and neglect, elder abuse and neglect, okay? When providing counseling services to families, couples or groups, a member of the profession shall seek agreement among the parties involved concerning each individual's right to confidentiality and the obligation to preserve the confidentiality. Now, I think it's important for them also to understand that you cannot guarantee that, because you can't control people. If we could, maybe everyone would be leading functioning lives. I don't know. But you can't guarantee. I have this happen in an inpatient setting all of the time. Someone leaves group. It's an SOS group, so safe offender strategies. They've talked about their offending past. No one knows that they've offended against children. And then I've got this guy that runs out of the group and tells everyone that he's offended against children. That is going to inherently damage the group rapport, the building. It's going to make that person whose information was shared feel bad. But as a group, people typically will rally around that person and have responses that are very strong towards the other people. So there's a lot of processing that happens when there's a breach of confidentiality. Group dynamics, personal dynamics, they will interfere with that sometimes. But it's always a moment to be reflective with the clients and talk to them about the importance of confidentiality. Do some empathy exercises so that they understand what it may feel like to have your information disclosed that you weren't wanting disclosed. And sometimes the group has a survivor tribunal or something. I've heard of that as well, where they're like, you're voted off the island, and tiki torches and all. But so these are rules that pertain to research on human subjects. Not everyone in here does research. I personally took a pass on that because I do not like statistics. Who in here does? Okay. That's about what I expected. So, a member of the profession shall ensure that the welfare of a client is in no way compromised by the research or the experimentation that you're doing. And presenting case studies in classes, professional meetings, or publications, licensed members of the profession shall disguise the identity of clients to assure full confidentiality. Practicum seminar would be a great case, and maybe Diane would like to contribute some information with practicum seminar. There's that fine balance of disclosing information to learn from each other and also to contribute to maybe someone else's issue, and then disclosing too much information. I can tell you in Farmington or even smaller areas than that, the risk is very high, but we also, even though we think like, oh, St. Louis and we're all spread out at these different agencies, stories can start to sound very familiar and you can identify people. So I don't know, Diane, any standouts from that?
I don't have any explicit examples, but it is a situation that in academia we face all the time, because we often have students bring case studies to class to help, make the content more relevant. And so we do have to be particularly careful about instructing them what to share, what not to share, to make sure that they are upholding the confidentiality of the client and the agency. And
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, a lot of instruction, a lot of conversations surrounding how to maintain that confidentiality while still benefiting from the learning experience. I mean, who in here remembers practicum seminar? I would expect a few more hands, especially if you had Diane O'Brien. But so, I mean, think about the times where you really benefited from that. Like I had one instance where a student, and as the instructor or really the facilitator of that class, you're facilitating the discussion and then contributing as needed. And there was one student who came in and said, this is in hospice, and as we know, sex offenses, substance abuse, mental health, all of these things can occur across all of these lifespans through developments. And this social worker refused to treat this client, and she was the only social worker for the agency. Thoughts on that? Okay, important. But then on the other hand, how do we get that person the treatment they need? So the student solution in support with the class was that she's going and she's helping to do some of these things to prevent as much contact or as minimal contact as needed. So that was an interesting and lively discussion in class that day. And what was great is that so many of her classmates had feedback. It's the same in here, that people can have different opinions and feedback, and it's extremely educational for the students. And towards the end, if we have time too, I will pull up NASW Code of Ethics regarding students, since we are at a university and we're discussing behavioral health and how students are interacting with that system. In conducting any research on human subjects, a member of the profession shall not violate any laws or regulations of the state or the federal government. I mean, I think that's pretty standard, like don't break laws. You might get arrested. When planning any research activity dealing with human subjects, a member of the profession shall ensure the research problems, design, and execution are in full compliance with this lovely code that you can probably Google. A member of the profession in evaluation or research must obtain voluntary and written informed consent from the participants. They know what they're participating in. These things came about because of research studies gone awry. Can anyone think of what some of those research studies were?
The one where they pretended it was a prison?
Okay. The Stanford, was it Stanford? Okay. Yeah, that. These people who had kind of become friendly with each other go into a prison, and they're separated as prison guard and prisoners, and they quickly adopted the personalities of those two roles. The Shocking, I can't remember who. Milgram, thank you. Instructing people and how we respond to authority, and they say, go higher, despite the screams, like, that's pretty traumatizing to the participants. We don't want to do harm through our research, because ultimately our research should be guiding better treatment and empirically based things or evidence-based. So they should have knowledge of the risks and the benefits of the research. For example, like with drug trials, they may say, you might be given a placebo, you might be given the drug. Before, they just wouldn't even tell you that you might be given a placebo. So competence. Hopefully we are all competent in what we're doing, and if we're struggling, that's why we have continuing education. That's why we have supervisors and peers we can consult with. But a member of the profession shall limit his or her practice to the areas for which he or she is trained. Again, you don't want me doing EMDR on you. It will not be successful. I'm not sure how it will turn out, but it's just not going to be pretty. Utilize consultation on an as-needed, self-determined basis. Be knowledgeable about how and when to utilize the expertise of other professionals. Just because you're seeking expertise from someone doesn't mean they need to know the name or necessarily the identifying information of the client. You can still give them the background and they can assist with that consultation. Have structured ways of doing that consultation. Where do you think one of the biggest breaches of confidentiality happen? Restaurants, lunch tables at facilities, and people are like, oh my God, you won't believe what happened today. Which, I mean, we have some interesting jobs. But yes.
When you consult with somebody and you're getting their opinion about whether this is a need a warrant or whether you need to hospitalize or anything, does the person you're consulting with end up with any potential liability in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, if that's documented that you consulted with them, otherwise no one will ever know it happened. But, and they could advise you differently than the way that you acted too. So I think there can be liability in a lot of the things that we do. But as long as we're doing our best faith effort and thinking ethically when we're consulting, that should hopefully translate well. But there are no 100% in anything that we do. So any other questions from that? Some agencies, especially like private practices, will have information in their informed consent that may very well consult our colleagues about your case. So that's important to know as well, whether that should go in your HIPAA notice or your informed consent. Be knowledgeable about how and when, we already did that. Maintain accessibility to your clients. I have the luxury of being on call 24/7. Is anyone else in that situation? So you know where I'm at. But, I have forwarded all of my phone messages to my other colleagues who are also on call for their clients. I typically try to let people know when I can, but if they call my number, they know who to call. For the people who don't work 24 hours, what might usually be on their phone message? BHR. Yeah, and then, mow cars down south and or wherever the dividing line is. You can find that information on DMH's website or ACI's. And so yeah, BHR, if this is an emergency, please go to the emergency room or call the crisis hotline. Because it's important that our clients know, even when they don't have access to us, how they can get help. Does anyone work for a crisis hotline? We have one person. Do you usually work the evenings, daytime? Wherever, okay. That should be the attitude of a crisis worker, right? Are you part of a mobility team? Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, sometimes you're going into these communities, you're going out to these people, you're communicating with law enforcement. I mean, you guys do a fantastic job of really knowing where to refer this person to and how to get them help. And sometimes I'm guessing it might just be talking to them most of the time, which is a great crisis to hear. They need someone to talk to as opposed to this is a life-threatening crisis. Hang up and call 911. What is it? I know, no. You're like, I'm calling 911. I need your address. Yes. So promote the welfare of clients in the selection, utilization, and interpretation of assessment measures and strategies of intervention. Recognize the effects of socioeconomic identifying factors such as ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and racial and cultural factors on clients in assessment and planning services. I have worked for an agency who refuses or has refused to identify a transgendered patient by their chosen name by the gender that they are saying they identify. And that's really complicated because how do you treat a person when you're not treating the whole person? And that's basically what this is saying. You have to consider every facet of who this individual is to really be successful and address the issues that they might be having. And I think it goes back to the question that was given as well, like what do you do if you know an employee is racist or know that they may be discriminating against one of these classes of individuals? Consulting with them, consulting with the supervisor, because at the end of the day, we certainly don't want to do harm. Use careful deliberation before assuming responsibility for the client. When a client's judgment is seriously impaired, the client should resume responsibility for him or herself as quickly as possible. Seek treatment for personal, medical, substance abuse, physiological, and emotional problems to ensure that they are not interfering with their ability to provide services to the client. So these are things that we as social workers need to be doing. If you're a social worker and because of low blood pressure, you're passing out in the middle of therapy session, it's probably not benefiting your client, and it may be freaking them out. So make sure that you're having that addressed by a medical professional. Or as a human being, you're having a tumultuous time in your life or some emotional or mental problems, you need to make sure that those are addressed, because what I've learned is whenever we see clients for a length of time, they get to know our nonverbals, they get to know the way that we're responding, and they can be very sensitive to that fact. So please make sure that you're taking care of yourself, which always, the eternal dilemma of self-care, but then agencies don't always promote that. So you have to find ways within the confines of what you're doing to make sure that you're caring for yourself. Yes?
I'm aware of a case where they just kept ratcheting up the productivity expectations. And the therapist was in an emotional state where she knew she couldn't do good work.
Right.
And she insisted, and they kept insisting and insisting. Is there anything else you can do in that?
I can't necessarily provide legal advice, but I always refer people back to their organization's policies. Are there things in place like FMLA? Can they have doctors submit notes? Things of that nature. Ultimately, if you have a facility or an organization that's not receptive to that, that may not be the right fit for you. And that can be hard if that's a consumer base and fellow employees that you like working with, but ultimately, you have to care for yourself. And if you're not allowed to care for yourself at your agency, then it's just not the right fit. Because she could have been the best therapist any of us have ever met, but if she's not allowed to practice in a way that she's comfortable, in a way that she's being taken care of, then she's suddenly become less effective, and even if potentially harmful to herself or to someone else. So always look at the organization's policies, look at the procedures, and then see how that can potentially address your needs. Take all necessary and reasonable steps to maintain continued competence in the practice of social work by completing at least 30 clock hours. That's why you're here, probably. As we know, 3 hours of ethics is required, and that's for every 2 years. And then we have a breakdown of CEUs and how they can be achieved. Occasionally, we will have people who submit their CEUs, and they're all over the web or through self-study. So there's actually a procedure in place that shows you, and I hope I pulled up the right one. Yes. There's a procedure in place where if you are a new licensee, so you just have become an LMSW, or you went from an LMSW to an LCSW, you can have your licenses, you can have your continuing education prorated by this schedule up here. And if at any time you have questions, I always encourage people, call our office staff, Tiffany, Kim, and Vicky, who are all very educated on the formalities of becoming licensed and renewal. But it also has a breakdown of how you can achieve these hours. So university or college courses that the licensee successfully completes for credit can count. I've had some professionals, maybe they're seeking reciprocity in another state. The requirement is that they have a DSM-5 class. So now they've come to my DSM-5 class. They can count that for their license. A maximum of 15 hours for the completion of self-study programs, 3 hours for the publication of an article in a non-peer-reviewed publication, 5 hours for publication of an article in a peer-reviewed professional publication, 5 hours for the publication of 1 chapter in a social work-related professional book. Seems like a lot of work. 10 hours for the publication of an entire book. That is a lot of work. All of us have seen those. So a maximum of 5 hours for the initial one-time preparation and presentation of a social work course, seminar, or workshop during a renewal period. Historically, if you taught ethics, you didn't get to count that as your ethics. We recently made a decision that you could because you have to do research on this material to teach it. And you're receiving feedback from the audience. You're hearing their opinions and their experiences, as well as like today, I'm doing the 2-hour presentation, which is almost over. So, you know, you're almost there. And then we have a fantastic panel coming up. And then for the Columbia people who are tuning in live, they also, this is considered face-to-face or a live seminar, even though it's over the interwebs. Those were air quotes in case Columbia couldn't see that. But basically they're participating live, they get the live credit, it doesn't count as self-study, whereas historically it was kind of a gray area. So that's always good to know. A maximum of 3 hours during a renewal period can be used for supervision that's performed. This can happen, another licensee's therapy skills. Sometimes we put people on probation and they go, one of their terms might be that they receive additional supervision. You could count that. You could count field instruction. Attending workshops or seminars, and it goes through this whole list of things. If you are interested in providing a workshop or seminar and you're not affiliated with the university or it's approved by one of these organizations, there's a way that you can submit that request. There are specific things that are required to present that and to be approved for contact hours. The office staff are fantastic and will help you through that process. And then I get an email saying, hey, what do you think about this training? It'd be pretty sad if I had to deny my own, but I wouldn't have the option. They would send it to someone else. But as a university, we can provide these courses without the approval because they know that we have a certain standard of providing. A member of the profession shall not engage in, we're going back to things that are beyond your scope of practice and knowledge. So make sure that you are making a referral. If you're treating someone who maybe suffers from PTSD and the therapy that you're doing with them isn't effective, see if there's someone who does prolonged exposure therapy or EMDR and talk to them about those options and what they might prefer. And then give a referral so that they can receive maximum benefit from treatment. So we have a few minutes left. I basically am going to just click through this because the last slide tells us what that complaint and discipline process is, whereas the statute's kind of laid out in a different way. Basically, the board can refuse to license you. There are grounds for revocation. If you have a crime that's been committed within the last 10 years, if you have a crime that maybe you weren't honest about on your application or was committed 10 years prior, but it's serious and some cause for concern, we can have you come in. So there are a lot of ways that we can address issues to make sure that everyone's practicing safely. Sometimes even if it's new things like a DUI, you might come in and you might tell us, like, these are the steps that I've been taking to make sure these things don't happen again. And we consider each case on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes even if we just send a letter of concern, we're like, here's our letter of concern, and you're also required to do our free jurisprudence exam, which is 2 free CEs as well. And then the board specifies whether that can be counted towards CEs or not. So a complaint is submitted to the committee, and I will, actually I'll show you the complaint process now. So file a complaint. If a complaint is submitted to the committee, you are provided a copy of that complaint for an opportunity to respond. And basically, you'll receive a letter like this from Don Egan, who's our chief investigator, because we have an investigatives unit. You will provide, or you should provide, an authorization so that they can contact you, so that if you are a person being treated by the individual against whom you're lodging the complaint, they can release records for the review. So then, this is a uniform complaint, which means you can check a lot of things. Sometimes the complaint's made against a social worker, but they check psychology, so they forward it to us and vice versa. And you just fill out these sections. A lot of people ask if you have to write your name. I always tell them that they need to contact the office and talk with the staff. Is it going to jeopardize your career or your safety? Things of that information need to be taken into consideration. But obviously, if a complaint's just submitted and we have no idea who submitted it, we can't really follow up unless other names were given. Sometimes a complaint's filed because someone is saying they're a social worker and they're not. Because it's title protection, we can have an injunction placed against that person.
I filed a complaint before because my previous, the girl that was giving me supervision wouldn't submit my hours to BJC to show that I had did.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, that's worth submitting. You worked hard for those hours. $60 every week adds up quickly. So, I mean, you have to advocate for yourself, too, through this complaint process. We've had organizations in certain sects of the social work field who say, like, hey, I don't think that this is, that a BSW can practice this level of skill, or that a MSW should be doing this if they're not clinically licensed. So we always have to review those things. It's good to ask a question sometimes, and maybe staff can guide you, but or maybe it could go on the agenda for discussion at our next meeting, which happens once a quarter. But either way, it's good to know what your options are. So if you have to file a complaint, do that, because you're advocating for yourself or your profession, potentially. The licensee has an opportunity to respond to the claim, typically in writing. The committee reviews the complaint and the licensee's response. The committee may dismiss the complaint or request investigation, which is where Don Egan comes in. The committee may refer the complaint to legal counsel seeking formal discipline. So that we actually have legal counsel on the committee with us, but that usually goes to the AG's office. Disciplines that may be imposed: a letter of concern. It is not a formal discipline. No one knows that you received this. It's basically like, we have a few concerns on the way that you're practicing, but it's not violating ethics. And the key word could be yet, because if it continued, then it could really become an issue. You have public censure, which goes on your record. People can access that when they access your license, and they know that there's been an issue in the past. Probation is not to exceed 5 years, and typically a term of probation might be that you're under supervision, just like you were under supervision for your license initially. You might have to find a licensed professional who would provide that. Suspension, which means you are not practicing as a clinical social worker or a master's level or a bachelor's level who is licensed, whereas on probation you can practice. And then revocation would mean that the license is revoked. There's a loophole that we're trying to close. Basically, like, oh, you revoked my license, but I can apply again tomorrow. I mean, so we're working on that, and I'm not sure if that one has to go through the governor's office or not. Or it can be any combination of the above. Typically, if maybe we give a 2-year probation, we don't receive a response, then we could escalate that to revocation, or we could increase the probation or the terms. And you always have the ability to appeal the decision with the Administrative Hearings Commission, and if you're not successful there, with the circuit court. So I think the biggest thing coming in is on your application, always make sure that you're being honest. We will see if you have a criminal history. If you have questions about whether this counts and should be reported, call the board. Some people are like, oh, should I report a domestic disturbance, or should I report, because it talks about civil lawsuits, should I report a protection order? So just call the board, talk to them about that. They'll give you insight. They may just say, send a quick one-line sentence or whatever. Just make sure that, I mean, we hear this all the time, but practice ethically, be honest when asked questions, especially by the board, but really anyone. So any questions, comments, concerns, since we are at 2:45? So I would encourage you also to look at the NASW Code of Ethics of Working with Students. It's going to be very similar in a way that we're working with our clients. We're not having inappropriate relationships with them or dual relationships, which can be challenging if like maybe the office is like, hey, let's all go out and have dinner and go out for drinks. The student isn't your colleague, they're your student, and you have that power imbalance. So those are things that you might want to consider. The students are there to learn, so please make sure that you're working with them and teaching them, showing them why you do the things that you do. And I would also encourage you to be receptive to their feedback, because after years of practicing in this field, sometimes we become a little bit stuck in our ways maybe, and it's good to have that new insight. So keep that in mind. Please take the time to supervise students, supervise licensees if you can, because that's another part of our ethics, is that we're making sure that we're reciprocating and giving back to our community. So, all right, well, thank you so much, and we'll facilitate a panel discussion after a break. So be back by 3 p.m.? All right.